In the meantime, I'm joined now by the retired British Army officer Richard Kemp, and he joins me from northern Israel near the Lebanon border, and former UK Defence Secretary Michael Portillo. Richard Kemp, what are you seeing there on the border?
Well, today, while I've been up here, there have been at least 2 and possibly more attacks by Lebanese Hezbollah against Israelis, including, I think, one that killed 2 civilians and wounded some others. So the situation in the north is hotting up just as the Israelis are prepared to go into Gaza. And of course, the 2 things are completely connected. Both Hamas and Hezbollah in the north are sponsored and funded and armed by Iran.
Are you seeing a big build-up of troops in northern Israel, Richard?
There is a significant build-up of troops in northern Israel, and there's also, I was talking this morning to the mayor of one of the cities that's about 2 kilometres away from the border with Lebanon, who is deeply concerned about the safety of his citizens. They've got bomb shelters. They're worried about, obviously, massive rockets being fired into their village, or their town, which is more than within Hezbollah's capabilities. And also they're concerned about Hezbollah coming in, crossing the border and coming in and doing to their communities what Hamas did to communities near the Gaza border. Except that the concern is that this is not Hamas. This is a far more effective, I hesitate to use the word professional, but a far more effective, better trained, disciplined terrorist organization, which potentially could wreak even more slaughter on the population than Hamas did in the south.
Are they expecting an attack, Richard?
Well, they've already had attacks over the last few days.
In number.
Yeah, I think in the last few days I've seen there have been attacks probably of greater intensity on the border there than at any time since the last war in Lebanon, and there's an expectation that this will continue. Whether it intensifies or whether it continues at this sort of rate, which is bad enough, is obviously a question that only Hezbollah can answer.
You've likened Hamas to ISIS, Islamic State, in an article in the Telegraph overnight. But you think that force is the only way to respond to this crisis? Absolutely. There is no other possible way.
Hamas is not interested in negotiation. They're not interested in any form of compromise. Their charter makes it absolutely clear that their purpose, their sole purpose, is the destruction of Israel and the slaughter of Jews in Israel and around the world. Now, how do you negotiate with that? Because the Israelis are not willing to compromise and say, fine, you can slaughter some of our people, but not everyone. So clearly, there's no political solution to this. It's a tragedy in every sense. It's a tragedy. We've seen so many civilians killed inside Gaza already. We're going to see quite a few more, I think, by the time the Israelis finish. But when you have the choice between Hamas continuing to fire rockets at communities around Israel, crossing the border and slaughtering over 1,000 Israelis, or dealing with Hamas and unfortunately innocent civilians dying as well, then I don't think there is any choice. Yeah. And the reality is that Hamas fight from behind and within their civilian communities. They want the IDF to kill their civilians. That's what they want. And that's what they unfortunately are going to get to a large extent, even though the IDF in my experience, take extraordinary steps to prevent the loss of innocent civilians on the battlefield.
Richard, we'll come back to you in 1 second. Michael Portillo, you're a former UK Defence Secretary. Is he right? Is Richard Kemp right there, Michael Portillo, that the answer is force? I mean, there's a risk, of course, a huge risk of civilian deaths and casualties in Gaza.
I'm a former Defence Secretary and Richard Kemp is a former very distinguished soldier, and neither one of us relishes war because we understand how appalling war is. And I think the prospect at the moment is so deeply depressing, it's almost beyond the power of words to express. I think Richard Kemp is absolutely right that the Israelis see no alternative, that they have no alternative but to destroy Hamas. But we know that many people are going to be killed in that. There will be civilians killed, there'll be IDF killed, and there'll be Hamas killed. And Richard now opens up the prospect of at least a 2-front war with Hezbollah as well in the north. And so one just foresees such a flood, such a tide of death ahead of us. And yet none of us can see any alternative. This is obviously appalling for all the people involved and extremely dangerous for the world. And let us just remember that it's only one of two major wars about which we're very concerned at the moment.
That's right. Do you worry about that? I mean, the war in Ukraine is going on, Michael Portillo, right now, of course, but now it's not in the news. We're focusing rightly on Gaza and Israel. But you can, in terms of the issue of bandwidth, which was discussed earlier by David Lammy on this programme, do you think there is a problem with bandwidth? Can the West cope with the pressure of these two different conflicts?
I think there is such a problem, and I think it existed even before the Hamas attack last Saturday. That is to say that already there were signs of Western fatigue and the possibility of Donald Trump becoming president of the United States again obviously raises the question of how committed the United States will be to Ukraine. And I must say, the Trump position puzzles me very much, because it seems to me that those of us who believe in decency and democracy and accountability in an open society, we need to see the right people winning and the wrong people losing. And if Russia were to win in Ukraine, that's very much an example of the wrong person winning. Yep. And if terror were to triumph in Israel, that would be another such example. Israel is a very capable military force, and although it will lose many troops and although many civilians will die and many Hamas will die, I suppose we have confidence that Israel will complete the job. In the case of Ukraine-Russia, I suppose we have less confidence, quite honestly, in ourselves that we're ready to complete the job.
Richard Kemp, back to you in northern Israel there. When you speak to members of the Israeli Defence Force, are they intent, they know what they're doing, they're clear on the mission here, they're clear on what's required of them, and they're clear of what's facing them, which could be a severe loss of life?
I've spoken to Israeli soldiers and commanders in the north on the border with Lebanon. I've spoken to Israeli soldiers and commanders around the Gaza border in the last few days. And there is a degree of apprehension, as any soldier will be apprehensive when about to set foot into a killing area. And so, they're worried, but what they are also is they're absolutely committed. Every single soldier I spoke to is dedicated to protecting the civilian population inside Israel. Many of them have family members or friends who were slaughtered last weekend. And then some people have spoken about retribution and vengeance. This is not about retribution and vengeance, and certainly that has not come through from any Israeli soldier I've spoken to. On the contrary, they don't want to go in and do what they've got to do, but they know they have to. They're ready to do so. Yep. And they also recognise, as Michael Portillo said, that there may well be heavy casualties among the Israeli Defence Force as well.
Well, Richard, we're looking now at live pictures from Gaza City. There's smoke billowing from a building there. When you spoke to members of the IDF, were they also concerned about the impact on civilians, who, of course, will be the victims in all this?
Yeah, absolutely they were. And in particular, the IDF commanders who are directing the air operation and who will be directing the ground operation are extremely concerned. And although it goes against the prevailing narrative in the West, the IDF are absolutely world-renowned for doing everything they possibly can to avoid civilian casualties on the battlefield. Very, very hard when the enemy is using civilians as human shields, but they are very good at it. That nevertheless doesn't mean there won't be more casualties. I think there will be. I think there'll be many more civilian casualties. But I'm very confident myself, from my own experience with the Israelis, that they will do everything they possibly can to avoid that happening.
Well, Richard Kemp, thank you. Michael Portillo, back to you in the studio here. You were a Defence Secretary in the 1990s when the IRA were doing their attacks on mainland Britain. Was there a big debate then about what to call the IRA? A terrorist group that we're told that the BBC didn't call them a terrorist group at the time.
The biggest debate was at a time when the BBC was giving a voice to those who were speaking on behalf of the IRA, and the Conservative government, of which I was a member, as I recall, legislated to make that illegal. And what the BBC then did was to get around the law by continuing to show the pictures of the people who were speaking on behalf of the IRA and their political parties, but they would voice over with an actor's voice. And I think at that point the government gave up the struggle. So those who were speaking on behalf of republicanism, including violent republicanism, continued to have a voice on the BBC, albeit that an actor would actually pronounce the words. So I don't remember the dispute being about the word terror, But that there was a dispute between the government and the BBC, that I certainly do recall. And I recall, actually, funnily enough, I recall staying in a hotel once, and there was a person who worked for the BBC there, and I said to her, is this debated within the BBC? And I remember she said to me, no, within the BBC, we all agree that we should give a voice to those people who represent the other side. And I said, but that's quite extraordinary. I don't know of any organisation, particularly not one of 90,000 people, where everyone has the same view.
Did you find it extraordinary this debate's happening now, or do you? I mean, you've been in the media for a while now. You're on the BBC side in this debate?
No, I'm not on the BBC side, and I'm not particularly against them either. They have a long-standing policy, which I think they have applied somewhat erratically, which is not helping their case. And it's also not helping their case that what we saw last weekend was so horrific. How could you describe it as anything other than terrorism? But the BBC is in it for the long term and is trying to sustain some sort of position in journalism.